After criticism, I just remember I didn't read nothing, but I'm going to read something now. I'm going to read. I have to make this special economy. Al Jazeera special economy in no time. As usual, the app is delaying.
Estación Portales.
Para mí siempre es un placer espero que salga bien. Y ahora me voy a despedir como costumbre de ese hermoso oficio. Voy a pasar para saludarlos y también si ahí.
Let's read. So, U.S. steel shares soar on Trump's apparent blessing for deal with Nippon Steel. Investors shared what appeared to be Nippon Steel receiving approval for its long-planned takeover. Investors interpret Trump's comments to mean Nippon Steel has received his approval for its takeover. May 23, 2025. United States President Donald Trump has expressed support for Nippon Steel's $14.9 billion bid for U.S. Steel, saying their quote-unquote planned partnership will create jobs and help the U.S. economy. Maybe that's what Donald Trump was saying about foreign investment. Shares of U.S. Steel soared 21% on Friday after Trump's comments as investors interpret the president's post on Truth Social to mean Nippon Steel had received his approval for its long-planned takeover, the last major hurdle for the deal. Quote, "This will be a planned partnership between United States Steel and Nippon Steel, which will create at least 70,000 jobs and add $14 billion to the U.S. economy." Quote, end quote. Trump said in a post on Truth Social on Friday. This week, the Reuters news agency reported that Nippon Steel has said if the merger is approved, it will invest $14 billion into U.S. steel operations, including up to $4 billion in a new steel mill. Trump added that the bulk of that investment will occur in the next 14 months and said he will hold a rally at U.S. Steel in Pittsburgh next Friday. Nippon Steel said it applauded Trump's decision to approve the quote-unquote partnership. The White House did not immediately reply to questions about the announcement. U.S. Steel share price kept rising after hours and reached $54, just shy of Nippon Steel's $55 per share offer price made in late 2023. While no details were released, investors expressed confidence that terms will be similar to those agreed in 2023. Investors said that eventually U.S. Steel will no longer be publicly traded and they will receive a cash payout for their shares. Politically controversial. The deal has been one of the most highly anticipated on Wall Street after it morphed into the political arena, with fears that foreign ownership will mean job losses in Pennsylvania, where U.S. Steel is based. It factored into last year's election that saw Trump return to the White House. Pennsylvania Senator Dave McCormick,
Estación Francia.
who also called the deal a quote-unquote partnership, on Friday said it was a quote huge victory for America and the U.S. Steel Corporation, end quote, that will protect more than 11,000 Pennsylvania jobs and support the creation of at least 14,000 more. The last pieces of the deal came together surprisingly fast. The Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., SFIUS, which reviews deal for national security risks, told the White House this week that the security risks can be addressed. Reuters reported, moving the final decision to Trump's desk. Following an earlier SFIUS-led review, former President Joe Biden blocked the deal in January on national security grounds. The companies sued, arguing they did not receive a fair review process. The Biden White House rejected that view. The companies argued Biden opposed the deal when he was running for re-election to win support for the United Steelworkers Union in the battleground state of Pennsylvania. The Biden administration has defended the review as essential to protecting security, infrastructure, and supply chains. Trump also initially opposed the deal, arguing the company must be
Estación Bellavista.
owned and operated in the U.S. The United Steel Workers were against the deal as recently as Thursday, when they urged Trump to block the deal, despite the $14 billion investment pledge from Trump. For investors, including prominent hedge funds, the news spells relief after more than a year of waiting for a resolution. Quote, "There were huge high fives all around today," end quote, one recent investor said, adding, quote, "We understood Donald Trump's psyche and we played to our advantage here," end quote. Investors said Trump appears to have won ground after the pledge for new investments was increased. Quote, "This deal ensures that steelmaking will live on in Pittsburgh for generations," end quote, another investor said. Source Reuters, published on Al Jazeera English. Then we have economic, very political news. U.S. lifts first sanctions on Syria following Trump's surprise announcement. There's a photograph. U.S. President Donald Trump meets with Syrian President Ahmed al-Sharaa in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. The president announced that the sanctions relief in May ahead of an unannounced visit with Syrian leader Ahmed al-Sharaa by Al Jazeera staff, May 2023. The administration of the United States President Donald Trump has taken its first concrete action its first concrete action to deliver sanctions relief for Syria following a surprise policy pivot earlier this month. On Friday, the U.S. Department of the Treasury announced sweeping relief to an array of individuals and entities which it said will, quote, enable new investment and private sector activity consistent with Trump's America First strategy, end quote. The U.S. State Department, meanwhile, concurrently issued a waiver to a 2019 law, the Caesar Syria Civilian Protection Act.
Estación Puerto. Todos los pasajeros deben descender.
Ay. I'm going to finish this very article and I'm going to do it upside down. Hey. And here we go. And just 1 second. 1 second, will you? Just 1 second. In a statement, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said the waiver. Just 1 second. The U.S. State Department, meanwhile, concurrently issued a waiver to a 2019 law, the Caesar Syria Civilian Protection Act, that will, quote, enable our foreign partners, allies, and the region to further unlock Syria's potential, end quote. In a statement, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said the waiver will, quote, facilitate the provisions of electricity, energy, water, and sanitation, and enable a more effective humanitarian response across Syria, end quote. The authorization covers new investment in Syria, provisions of financial services, and transactions involving Syrian petroleum products. Quote, today's actions represent the first step on delivering on the President's vision of a new relationship between Syria and the United States, end quote, Rubio said on Friday. Trump surprised the international community when on May 13 he pledged to remove sanctions placed on Syria during the leadership of its now ousted leader, President Bashar al-Assad. Friday's announcements mark an initial step towards that goal as Syria recovers from abuses under al-Assad's government and 13 years of civil war. Quote, as President Trump promised, the Treasury Department and the State Department are implementing authorizations to encourage new investment into Syria, end quote. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said in a statement, quote, Syria must also continue to work towards becoming a stable country that is at peace, and today's actions will hopefully put the country on a path to a bright, prosperous, and stable future, end quote. Trump first unveiled his plans for sanctions relief during a tour of the Middle East in mid-May. He said lifting U.S. sanctions will give Syria, quote, a chance at greatness, end quote, since the restrictions left the war-torn country economically isolated. Quote, it's their time to shine. It's their time to shine. We are taking them all off, end quote, he said from Riyadh. Shortly after, Trump met and shook hands with Syrian leader Ahmed al-Sharaa, who had only recently been removed from the U.S., quote, specially designated global terrorist list, end quote. Appeal for relief. Calls for sanctions relief had grown following the fall of al-Assad's government last December. As head of the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham HTS group, al-Sharaa spearheaded the offensive that led to al-Assad fleeing the country, bringing the civil war to an end. The war, which first broke out in 2011, had left Syria's economy in tatters. As many as 656,493 people were killed during the conflict, according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. And a 2020 report from the United Nations estimated that the country suffered total economic losses of about $442.2 billion in the first 8 years of the war alone. Sanctions have further dampened Syria's economic outlook, making it difficult for countries with ties to the US to conduct business there. Since taking power in December, Syria's interim government has argued the ongoing sanctions, largely imposed during al-Assad's rule, will slow development and cause further instability. Trump's announcement earlier this month buoyed hope for many Syrians of a new path forward, although the extent of the relief had remained unclear. And there's a photograph. The European Union has lifted all sanctions on Syria. Earlier this week, the European Union also announced it had lifted sanctions against Syria. Friday's sanctions relief in the US applies to the, quote, the government of Syria, as in existence on or after May 13, 2025, end quote, according to the Treasury Department. The reprieve also applies to several previously sanctioned transportation, banking, tourism, and fossil fuel entities. Transactions related to Russia, Iran, and North Korea remain under US sanctions. One of the biggest hurdles, however, is the Caesar Syrian Civilian Protection Act, a law that was passed in 2019 during Trump's first term. It included broad sanctions that target al-Assad's government and its allies and supporters for atrocities committed against civilians. And there's a video. A decision by the EU to lift sanctions on Syria will allow businesses to engage in international trade more easily. The act was named after a former Syrian military photographer and whistleblower who smuggled out of the country a cage of images showing torture and mass killing at detention centers run by al-Assad security forces. But since the law was passed by Congress, it will likely take an act of Congress to completely lift its restrictions. The president, however, can issue temporary waivers to the law, which is what the Trump administration did on Friday. Source Al Jazeera and news agency. Published on Al Jazeera English. And that's it by now. Upside down news. That was Valparaiso Port